noite sobre primeiro.
For creative people to have the time of their life.
Fashion is something I'm super passionate about.
Here you work together towards a goal.
Times you were being trained for industry and we're working to industry stunts. So the entire time you're in college, it's like you're working.
It's actually like a holiday from Monday to Friday.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, it is a very big pleasure that we can all welcome you in Bratislava, although you already have been working last day and a half, day and a half. Now it is the official launch of our summit. This is a very special moment for all of us. We have been working and we have been really concentrated, and it's really making me happy to see that everything's working, that you're really enjoying it, and especially that together we are creating something which I maybe can say is the Film EU Plus community. So welcome again, and let me pass the word around. Next to me is sitting Director of Academy of Performing Arts in Bratislava, Professor Martin Šmatlák. Next to Professor Martin Šmatlák, you can see the coordinator of Film EU Plus Alliance, Professor Manuel José Damasio. And next to Manuel, you can see the Professor Darina Smržová, the Dean of Film and TV Faculty, Bratislava.
Thank you, Jana. This is Jana Kiebel. She's the coordinator and the chief manager, chief executive officer of this meeting, and she works a lot for the successful event. Good afternoon to everybody, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students. I would like to say you a couple of words about the situation in Slovak audiovisual industry, but to avoid the main symptom of traditional professor's disease, which means to speak a lot and to say not so much, I have prepared it in a classical written form, and hoping it will be brief and not completely boring. So, allow me to welcome you to our official opening of a Film EU Summit 2024, and I am truly happy that our school is invited of this event. I feel it partly symbolic that we are meeting here in the week when 75 years have passed since the day when the Slovak Parliament approved the law establishing the Academy of Performing Arts in Bratislava. Exactly, it happened on June the 9th, 1949. It is a great honor for us to present something from our long-standing tradition to you, and at the same time get to know your experience and ideas for further development. I consider this event as a very important step that will open the way for our school to even more intensive international cooperation and to new partnerships. That is why I'm sincerely looking forward to the coming months and years, although we all know that the path to the shared vision we are talking about will certainly not be easy. A good school shall be created not only by legal regulations, complicated administrative procedures, or generous financial contributions. Of course, all these matters are important for operation and development of each institution focused on education and culture. But since the Platonic time, we have known that our knowledge arises and develops in dialogue that can take place anywhere. I don't mean that we should also meet in the olive garden, surrounded by a high wall and symbolically guarded by ancient hero Academos. But we can inspire by an idea that the Platos Academy, as a free institution, is able to survive for more than 9 centuries, because this idea still works as a quite convenient principle also for us. Today we will also discuss future models for the film industry in small countries. It is a matter of substance, because the audiovisual industry and culture represents the main professional space for our students, graduates and teachers too. Usually the genuine and creative cooperation which arises at school thereafter continues in professional practice as long-term cooperation and partnership. Over the past 3 decades, our country went through several models of functioning and also non-functioning system of film industry. After the split of Czechoslovakia, we converted to a small audiovisual country, mostly close to the rest of the world. And in short time, Central Slovak Film Studio has finished its 50 years story, and 2/3 of cinemas definitely disappeared in our country. First, the release of new Slovak films per year could be counted on one hand fingers, and most of them were co-productions with a minority Slovak cultural and financing contribution. At the first decade of this millennium, Slovak public investment in audiovisual industry per capita was less than €1, while the average in EU countries was approximately 4 times more. As a film country, we found ourselves very close to the edge, and in some years our school was the only space for an independent filmmaking in Slovakia. Today, we have a functional system of public support led by the Slovak Audiovisual Fund, a public institution which is still accordingly independent of shaky political zone. There is an adequate network of cinemas with modern technical equipment in all Slovak regions, and the number of new Slovak films per year has increased to more than 40. We have well-operating Slovak film agency, and our producers are actively involved in international projects with an increasing number of countries. Thanks to the cash rebate system, film crews from abroad come to Slovakia, shooting films and relatively large budget series here, and it is a good base for further development of professions and our infrastructure. After 3 decades, we have become an open film country operating at the regular European niveau. Our audiovisual industry, although it is not large, is able to cooperate at an international level and achieve results even at major international film festivals. This process was not easy. We often had stormy quarrels and serious debates. We urged politicians and businessmen. We overcame barriers in communication and in the ability of international cooperation. But at the end of this long distance running, it was really profitable, and I believe that Slovak audiovisual industry will be able to maintain this position and to develop its potential. Our current model of film industry in a small country is viable, and it can be developed also by such cooperation as the Film EU project represents. This project is something like a large international film co-production of more than 2 parties. We are also looking for a way to realize a common intention. Although in one large European area with an ancient cultural tradition, we have more or less different conditions and more or less different results. And above us is an umbrella of multiple European regulations and monumental administration. But just as there is no one optimal model of international co-production, there are no universal solutions for our project either. If such a model could exist, we wouldn't have to meet or to discuss. We would just give a simple joint task and the AI would solve it for us. Fortunately, it, or she, or he, I don't know, is not able to do it yet. Let's therefore continue to debate together about how we will prepare a good script for filming, which is coming soon. Then how we will cut the material which has been shot, how to add a good sound, colors and special effects in post-production, and how to show the final cut at successful world premiere. It doesn't have to be in Cannes, just in our 8 cities. I wish you a pleasant stay in our city, and I believe you will not be there for the last time, and I'm looking forward to our next common activities. So thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I have the double pleasure of welcoming you to our first summit after the enlargement of FilmEU. So it's the first time we come together with all new partners after the start of the current grant period. So it's kind of an ongoing journey, but also a new one that starts. But I also have the pleasure of introducing our guest for the first part. Jakob Nielsen comes from Aarhus University in Denmark and is a member of a research project called Kreshine, where a number of the FilmEU institutions are also participating, an Horizon project that deals precisely with the competitiveness of the film and audiovisual industry in small countries. Small countries are precisely the nature of the countries that are also members of FilmEU, and that's why when organizing the summit we thought it would be very interesting to have an overlook of the, let's call it the state of the art in the small markets that Kreshine is covering, and you'll see that many of the countries represented in FilmEU are also covered by the Kreshine analysis, because FilmEU is at the end of the day also about how can we be together more than what we are alone. And precisely one of the potential roads for the development of the industry and artistic practices in these small countries is collaboration. And collaboration is what we are doing here. We'll be doing it for the rest of the week. And I would first of all like to thank Vishemu for welcoming us and organizing the summit. Obviously, thank all of you that are here, and say just 2 very brief words about the rest of the day. So after Jakob's presentation, we are going to have a very intense set of presentations on outcomes, but also potential avenues of development for the future, namely in relation with the innovation plan that both the partners in the pilot stage and the new partners are now working on towards the future implementation, but also on future prospects in terms of research development, but also pedagogical development with the results of the Samsara model that we've been piloting in the last 3 years. So having said that, I wish you all a very pleasant stay in Bratislava, very interesting meetings, reunions, collaborations, but also informal moments, because at the end of the day, and so, just like Jana just said, that's what makes a community, and those are the most important and treasured moments. So thank you very much, and we'll now move on to our first keynote. Jakob, thank you very much for being with us, and let's start, and we might move.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the invitation to all of the organizers of the FilmEU Summit. Manuel did a good job of presenting the Kreshine project, so I won't say much about that. But 4 avenues for small film ecosystems is what I've called my talk. And these 4 avenues were presented as part of a large collaborative research report that we launched a couple of weeks ago in Cannes in connection with the Cuisine project. And you can actually go and read the actual report here. It's an interactive website. It involved close to 20 authors. A few are actually present in this room even, so thank you for your contributions. These 4 avenues are one of the takeaways of this report. I believe it's an important takeaways, but there are many others as well. My close colleague Marius Øfsti, who's a Norwegian postdoc at our department, and we have worked very closely on these models or avenues, as we prefer to call them. But our close colleague Katrin Bengesser has also been involved, and we have obviously discussed these within the working group that I am leading. So it's a large collaborative project. And we also, I should add, see it as ongoing work, in the sense that we will actually return to these conceptual models towards the end of the project. But let's dive into it. These are the 7 ecosystems, as we call them, and Slovakia could equally as well have been one of our cases. But our 7 cases are Croatia, Denmark, Estonia, Flanders in Belgium, Ireland, Lithuania, and Portugal. And we've deliberately sampled these ecosystems to allow for variability. So you have Northern, Southern, Western, Eastern Europe represented. We also have world languages, as in Ireland and Portugal, and to some extent in Flanders. And we have very small language-oriented markets, as the Estonian one, or the Danish one, or Lithuanian or Croatian, for instance. Our hope is that by doing that, these 7 ecosystems also speak to other small European ecosystems, maybe also to others outside of Europe. But what I'll be speaking about today is based essentially on empirical analyses of these 7 ecosystems. And what we initially find is that all these 7 have at least one thing in common, namely that none of them have a domestic market that is big enough to sustain a local film industry. Maybe they did in the 50s when the media landscape was different, but they certainly don't today. So the next question is, what strategies are they actually using to address this key challenge? And this is where our research comes in, and we are essentially proposing that at least 4 avenues are important, are key. They are not the only avenues, but we think they're quite important. I would also say that obviously when you're looking at a small film ecosystem, you could also look towards, let's say, adjacent industries as a kind of a strategy. Let's say crossover or connection to the television industry, the gaming industry, advertisement, and so forth. That is completely true and relevant. But for this research, we're looking more at the film industries in themselves, so to speak. I mean, what kinds of options do they have within their own industries, so to speak? And what I'll do now is that I'll line up these 4 examples, and then I'll explain the process of arriving at these 4 avenues, and then towards the end of my talk, I will return to these 4 avenues. So the 4 avenues are cultural resonance, export, production service, and cinematic art. What we are arguing is that each is governed by a different policy context and has a different form of legitimacy, and that the success criteria are also different. The funding mix will also typically vary, but we still need to do more research in terms of this particular field. So let's say within the cultural resonance avenue, public funding is often key, although within this avenue there is actually potential for private financing as well, because many of the films promoted within this avenue, they aim at a large domestic market. The primary policy field is clearly cultural policy, could be a film law or film settlement or something along those lines. And the success criteria are usually also defined as cultural policy goals. Could be a high domestic market share, could also be related to the films themselves. I mean, their ability to speak to dilemmas and issues in the country of production, as well as to their importance to film culture more widely speaking. But within the export avenue, we're talking about a completely different ballgame. When relating to exports, the logic is essentially, okay, our domestic market is too small. Okay, we'll have to go elsewhere to find a bigger market. We'll have to go abroad. And here, international success of domestic films are the key form of legitimacy. The primary policy fields are different. Of course, different cultural institutions have quite wide policy ranges, but I think it's more along the lines of trade policy here. The success criteria are different again. We are talking about something like admissions in theaters abroad, or circulation on globally oriented VOD services, or other user metrics, and let's say commercial profits more widely speaking. The third avenue, refer to that as production service. This is different yet again. Here we're actually not necessarily talking about boosting local films, but bringing productions, television series, or high-end films to the country of production. Job creation, GDP are the primary forms of legitimacy, we would argue. And the policy fields are also different. Sometimes a mix of, let's say, employment, finance, sometimes also tourism policy. And this also is reflected in some of the success criteria as fiscal goals or employment goals, usually measured in, for instance, according to incoming investments, usually on the basis of either production rebates or various forms of tax schemes. The fourth avenue is also heavily reliant on public funding, but the legitimacy for that funding is slightly different. Here, the legitimacy is not as much tied to national cultural relevance, but essentially to artistic recognition. And although it's within the cultural policy realm, it's more within the sort of arts-based orientation within cultural policy. The success criteria could be translated to something like awards and nominations at festivals and critical accolades, more broadly speaking. So these are at least what we are hypothesizing are 4 avenues. And I think it's important to say that when we're looking at our 7 ecosystems, we sometimes see that an ecosystem is more clearly oriented towards one of these avenues. And in other cases, they're clearly pursuing at least 2, sometimes even more avenues at the same time. They are theoretically available to everyone, although our research also shows that there can certainly be tension amongst these different avenues. So for instance, if you're trying to combine production service orientation with cinematic art orientation, we find that it's often a form of balance. Let's say, for instance, Chris Marsic, who's the head of the National Screen Agency in Croatia, and also actually head of AFART, the supranational body for film agencies in Europe, he talks of these 2 avenues very clearly as a balancing act. So let's say the more you open up to incoming investments, the more you are also driving your local talent, your production designers, your cinematographers to high-end, sometimes American films or series. Obviously, they are then maybe not available to shoot the local art house film that you also want to have produced. They would also tend to drive up prices, so maybe that talent is not as accessible as it would otherwise be. So these avenues, they can work together, but there can also certainly be tension in terms of combining these avenues. Okay, so now I'll explain to you sort of the process of the research that sort of led us to these 4 avenues. One of the things that I did first, because I led this work, I think might be interesting to you as well, because you also manage working packages with many international partners, and you want to find space for specificity of each ecosystem, but you also want to create some kind of correspondence in terms of what are we actually producing. I mean, how can we somewhat harmonize the outputs of this research? So one of the things I did early on is I asked all the participants in my working team to make a kind of draft of their own ecosystem. Tell us a little bit about the film ecosystem in Ireland. A summary about the industries, what are the key issues,
the background, maybe the historical background, if that is important, it is in many cases quite important in some of our markets. Then also certain reflections on production, the funding infrastructure available, the production service initiatives, the distribution landscape, which is often overlooked, but I think quite important actually in terms of, at least in terms of fiction feature films and documentary feature films, which we are focusing on for this report. Then exhibition infrastructure as relates both to cinema and the VOD field, and also some reflections on festivals, like what festivals are important in your domestic market, and some assessment of the success of your local films in international festivals. I have to say this is one of the most pleasurable things I've ever been part of in a research project, to get this input back from our different partners. It was a wonderful learning experience of you getting to know film ecosystems that you didn't know much about before. And I think I at least learned quite a lot. And this actually ended up being a section of this report. So you will find a portrait of each ecosystem in this report, 5-6 pages, not that long, but still quite condensed and I think quite rich in detail. And I encourage you to read those portraits if you have the chance and are interested. Okay, so that's one thing. So these portraits were more qualitatively oriented. And they were written by many different people, local experts in the field, sometimes researchers, sometimes people from the industry, sometimes a combination. And they drew on all kinds of sources, on reports, on traditional academic research, and so forth. The next thing we did was trying to do some quantitative analysis. And this was essentially done within my team in Aarhus, 3 colleagues. We essentially looked at comparative parameters within the entire value chain of film production in these 7 ecosystems. So within production, for instance, we looked at production volume. Our sample years were 2014 to 2022. So we're talking about a 9-year period. And there, for instance, we could see what kind of production mix do we see in Lithuania or in Croatia, for instance. Are we seeing mainly 100% national films? Are we seeing mainly co-productions? And if so, is it essentially majority co-productions or minority co-productions, for instance, as an example? We did something else that I was really happy to do, but it took a lot of work. We did a genre analysis of the fiction films. Like across these 9 years, in these 7 ecosystems, we ended up with a total of 893 films. And we harvested the genre tags of these close to 900 films from a database called Lumiere Pro that some of you may know. But they essentially draw their data, or sort of genre tags from IMDb. We had to do some manual matching as well. But we ended up with something like 1,500 genre tags spread across these 900 films. And it actually allowed us to do something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. I just haven't found the project to do it. But we could do a kind of genre signature visualization. Like, okay, these are films from Portugal from 14 to 22. This is the distribution of genre tags in this repertoire of films. I really enjoyed that part, and I'll speak a little bit more about it later. So that was the second thing we did, and we have a lot of data points and a lot of comparisons that you can find in the report as well. And this is this quantitative aspect of the report is where you find most of the interactive visualizations, where you can choose whether you want to focus on Croatia versus Ireland or Lithuania versus Estonia and so forth. These were our primary data sources. The European Audiovisual Observatory has 2 databases. The first 2 on top are unfortunately databases that you actually have to pay to access. But we needed to do that. Along the line, the European Audiovisual Observatory actually became an academic advisor to the project. So in the end, they actually gave us access to free. But I think these databases were quite important to us. The EAO also has some databases that are freely available to everyone, like the VOD database. We use that in particular to do catalog analyses. So you wanted to see, okay, these close to 1,500 films, including documentaries that we're looking at, to what extent are they in VOD catalogs? And in what kinds of VOD catalogs? Unfortunately, it turned out that in many of the globally oriented VOD catalogs, our Cuisine films are actually not very present, with the exception of Amazon Prime. So if you look at VOD catalogs, it's actually mostly the local or regionally oriented VOD catalogs that actually have our films, at least numerically speaking. Yeah, and other data sources as well, such as Eurostat and so forth. But this is the quantitative dimension of the report. And what I'll do now is I'll just take out a few snippets from this quantitative dimension of the report. It's not representative, but I've kind of decided to be fair. So I have like a takeaway per ecosystem where a particular ecosystem stands out, for instance. So one thing that we discovered is that Estonia actually services its domestic audience with the highest number of films per capita. By far, actually, if you look at it. Maybe for good reason, because it's also the country with the least number of inhabitants, but still. It's also partially due to the fact that the 100th anniversary of Estonia happened in these years, which led to more public funding towards Estonian films. But still, I think it's quite significant in terms of how much, let's say, fiction and documentary films are actually put on display or served to the Estonian audience. But then what about Croatia, for instance? Croatia, in our market, close to half of their films were actually minority co-productions. So they had a very well-established minority co-production culture. They actually did not have the same kind of majority co-production culture. So this is specific to minority co-productions. And I would say that the specific work on minority co-productions and the importance that they have to our ecosystems is something that we actually need to work more on in the future. For this particular report, we had to focus in our sample on 100% national films and majority co-productions for obvious reasons. If you include minority co-productions, you will often end up double counting the same film. One country's majority co-production is obviously another's minority co-production. So there are some methodological reasons for not focusing too much on that. But I think that's something we want to do together with the European Audiovisual Observatory in the future. And Flanders. Flanders is by far the market with the most densely populated audiences. And this is also, you could say, reflected in the number of inhabitants per cinema. So in theory, actually, it should be easier to run a cinema in Flanders because you have a potentially very large customer base. Obviously, you need to do a more fine-grained sort of market analysis of where are these cinemas actually placed, geographically speaking, and so forth. But this is one of the outliers in terms of Flanders, for instance. Then we come to this genre signature analysis, and this looks very colorful, something like my kids going crazy with Excel or something like that. But this is actually one of our findings. Here you see quite clearly, actually, that Portugal has by far the most drama-oriented output in terms of this genre signature analysis. Close to half of all the genre signatures to these, if I remember correctly, more than 200 Portuguese films in this period were drama tags. And similarly, you can see Lithuania, on the other hand, was the most comedy-oriented in terms of the repertoire. What we use this genre signature analysis to do is then, okay, this is how the repertoire looks for these 9 years. How does that relate to the most successful films? And the two key takeaways, I think, here is that if you look at the top performing films internationally, then animation films clearly stand out. They're the outlier. They make out a very small, minuscule share of the total volume of production. But if you actually look at the top performing films in international markets, they make out a substantial chunk of these. N-Wave Pictures in Belgium is one of the reasons. Cartoon Saloon in Ireland and also some animation production going out of Denmark are the key reasons for this. In terms of top performers in the domestic market, we find that comedy punches above its weight, even in Lithuania. So if you consider sort of the relative share of comedies produced, they actually outperform their share in the repertoire when you look at the top performers. And then you have the example of who goes to the cinema most. I talked to some of my Irish colleagues just before this presentation, and historically, Ireland actually has the most cinema going population. But actually, at the moment for 2023, they actually don't. They have a very slow recovery rate for reasons that we still have to unearth, I think. But at least historically, they have gone more to the cinema in Ireland than they have in the other ecosystems. It might have to do with this fact that ticket prices are simply cheaper in Ireland, also when adjusted for purchasing power. But there could be other reasons as well. What might be a little more problematic is that although they go to the cinema more in Ireland than, at least historically speaking, they rarely go to see Irish films. And this is something you see in the next slide. This is domestic market shares. In other words, what's the share of your local films in terms of the overall admissions in your domestic market? And here Denmark is by far the outlier, having for these 9 years an average domestic market share above 30%. That's quite unusual, and I think it was partially skewed by the COVID years 2020 and 21, where the market share was 50% and 42%, which is also quite unusual. I don't think we'll see that anytime soon. But we also see here that we have 3 ecosystems where there's a real problematic disconnect between local films and local audiences. Namely Croatia, Ireland, and Portugal, which is something we certainly need to address and look into. And we see Estonia, Flanders, and Lithuania occupying a kind of middle ground, although there are some quite radical changes from year to year. Okay, so the next question for us was, okay, we have amassed all this empirical work, we've compared all these 7 ecosystems to each other according to many different parameters. We also actually in the report do some comparisons with larger European markets. I just don't have time to go into that part of the report today. But we essentially, this is something we also did at the outset, but we kind of revisited some of this literature. Let's say the media systems literature developed usually on the basis actually of journalism and television, not as often on the basis of film industries actually, unfortunately, which is a thing we want to correct. There's an avenue that I refer to as modes of production literature that tries to sort of create taxonomies of modes of production. There's another strand of research that's focusing on the cultural and creative industries at large. Like Miege or Havens and Lotz's work, for instance. My good colleague Peter Shepanich has worked on digital peripheries, and this is also relevant to us. And then there are value chain models and also very concrete money stream models that are sometimes used for this. I would say for these 4 avenues, the modes of production literature turned out to be the most important source of inspiration for us. This is actually from it doesn't matter that you cannot read the details of this, but this is from some of my two Danish researcher colleagues, Strandvad and Mathieu, who many years ago, I was actually part of a PhD seminar where they first pitched this model, incidentally. But they tried to delineate 3 different modes of production. A high concept model that was clearly inspired sort of by US blockbuster logics, an auteur avenue, and then an avenue they called high framework, which was modulated on Danish cinema in particular. I don't think these, I mean, these avenues in themselves are maybe not quite as relevant to us as the parameters they use. So they introduce parameters such as what's the form of legitimacy, what is the guiding logic, what's the key form of financing, who's the most important stakeholder within each of these avenues. So I think this work, it was important to us, but I think what we ended up with, we tried all kinds of, looking at all kinds of parameters, like say, what are actually the key parameters here? And we did something that is a little bit intimidating to researchers. We tried to simplify things, which we hate to do usually. But we tried to really simplify it and say, okay, we'll try and focus on 2 parameters. And one was an orientation towards public support, understood essentially as public subsidy, versus an orientation towards investment schemes, understood as production rebates or various forms of tax schemes. Then the other, let's say, parameter for us was the orientation towards domestic audiences versus an orientation towards international audiences. And we tried to see how far this could take us. And so we did this. And this, I have to explain this, but I think it was a little bit of an eye-opener to us when we first did this. The size of these circles, they tell you the scale of total admissions for all Irish films, both fiction, both documentary, from 2014 to 22, all Belgian films, all Flemish films, that's the VL, Flemish films, all Danish, all Croatian, all Portuguese, all Estonian, all Lithuanian. Okay, so these are the total admissions for all fiction and documentary films produced across this 9-year span. So how many of these admissions were actually on the home market and how many were in non-national markets? And this turned out to be somewhat of an eye-opener to us because you could see large disparities. At the very extreme ends, you see that in Lithuania, you have a very domestically oriented industry in terms of by far the largest share of admissions of the total of Lithuanian films are in Lithuania. Similarly, the case in Estonia, perhaps a bit more surprising in Portugal as well, because at least we were expecting to see some of, let's say, the strong art house traditions of Miguel Gomez or Pedro Costa and other filmmakers having, let's say, more international admissions in France, for instance, and other markets. But I think in this case, it was kind of outweighed by the domestic success of comedies in Portugal. And then at the other extreme, you find Ireland, where you see that Ireland is actually not a very important market numerically for Irish films, if you want to be very strict about it. And if you look at the pure numbers, we actually found out that Mexico was actually a more important market in terms of admissions for Irish films than Ireland itself was. So this was very surprising. It was surprising to us, at least, in terms of the scale, at least. So this was one aspect. Then we looked at direct public support. It's a little difficult to see which countries are. You get the first column is Croatia, then Denmark, then Estonia, then Flanders, then Ireland, then Lithuania, then Portugal. What we look at here are essentially that's a direct public support from the national screen agencies towards development and production only. So no marketing support, no support to cinemas or whatever. And I have to say there's a little bit of television funding included as well, because in some of these screen agencies' reports, we couldn't actually take funding for television production out, but not broadcaster investment, but something like the public service pool in Denmark, to those who know that funding. But here, even if you include purchasing power, Denmark is clearly the most quote-unquote generous in terms of the development and production support that they put out there to promote the production of documentary and fiction features. But then if you turn towards investment schemes, you find a completely different kind of funding logic at place. Here you actually see that, well, there's no production rebate, no tax credit scheme at all in Denmark. So that's, at the moment at least, a zero. It's a bit more, I mean, the vast sum of investment schemes that it's generated in Ireland makes it difficult to make this look like a nice graph, unfortunately, because, I mean, I do think that investment schemes are also important in Croatia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Portugal, and so forth, but they're just staggering in Ireland. I should say that in this case, we are actually, it's the actual reported eligible costs that we are showing here, so not the total investments generated, to make that clear. So this is actually the reported cost in these various production rebate schemes or tax credit schemes. There was some trouble in terms of Flanders in getting access to all tax schemes, but still it's fairly close to being correct. But this obviously I think is quite interesting, and what we did is then, okay, let's try and look at it relative to each other. Like, what's the relative scale in terms of you look at development and production support relative to investments from incentive schemes? And you get a visualization along these lines where you see all red in Denmark and close to all yellow in Ireland, and a lot of fluctuation actually in terms of the sort of relative scale in the various of the ecosystems. And the next question is, okay, we want to visualize this. We want to have like a signature that can demonstrate this. We played around with these spider graphs, where you have public support and investment scheme on one axis and domestic audiences and international audiences on the other axis. And then we could actually simply plot in the data that I just presented to you, and you get something like this. So this is kind of an empirically based ecosystem signature, or on the basis of these two parameters for Denmark and Ireland, which are quite different from each other. We did this for all our 7 ecosystems in the report, and I think it's that it itself is quite interesting. But we also wanted to see, okay, these are sort of empirical models. What would be kind of the conceptual possibilities available to these ecosystems? Can we kind of visualize those? And this is what we've tried to do here in this. So this is not, it's informed by empirical data, but it's not visualizing empirical data concretely. So this is where you can see, okay, then cultural resonance generally has a strong orientation towards public support and towards domestic audiences, export sharply oriented towards international audiences, production service sharply oriented towards investment schemes, cinematic art, I mean, still oriented, very much oriented towards public support, though not necessarily with the same sizes in terms of budgets. Also, we are arguing that there's an international orientation within the cinematic art avenue, not as much an orientation towards, let's say, family-oriented Flemish animation films, but an orientation towards, let's say, the art house audiences abroad. Think Lars von Trier, think Pedro Costa, filmmakers along those lines, for instance. Okay, so what about combinations? So we're essentially also arguing that, well, you try out to what extent a particular ecosystem can try to combine these forms of avenues into one, and also how can you potentially, as stakeholders within an industry, try to reorient your signature. Let's say you want to make cultural policy changes that align your local industry more with the cultural resonance model. How could you actually go about that? But this could potentially be Portugal or Croatia, for instance, potentially at least as kind of a theoretical exercise. So I think, so sort of to return to these 4 avenues, I say they are still sort of provisional avenues. We need to work more with them, but I think we are onto something here. And I think it's quite interesting to actually test these 4 avenues. And what I'll end up doing now is trying to discuss the use of these avenues in a context that they were actually not designed for. So one of the questions that we're having at the moment is that could you stretch the use of these 4 avenues to actually talk of them in relation to an individual film being oriented towards export, being oriented towards cultural resonance, production service, or cinematic art, for instance. We're going to try that out for sure. It's sometime we need to get more access to the funding mix also to make more clever analyses of these, how this influences the orientations as well. But the final thing I'd like to do is to discuss the second point here on my PowerPoint slide. Could these 4 avenues also guide discussions of, let's say, films that are actually not intended for the theatrical market? And this is one of my pet cases at the moment. You can see that some of the globally oriented streaming services, they have slowly started commissioning, well, first series, now also increasingly films, not in all of our cuisine ecosystems, but at least in some of them. And it's been at least within the context of sort of the discussion amongst industry stakeholders in Denmark, it's quite interesting to see how these commissioned local language films are being presented and discussed publicly. So both in interviews with Netflix executives, I've also myself moderated a panel with one of the policy leads of Netflix in Europe. And what you often hear from them is, well, when we commission a film like A Beautiful Life, which is at the outset a Danish language film, the argument is we are commissioning this film for the local audience. I'm not saying that that's strategically incorrect necessarily, but I would say that Netflix's own numbers tell a completely different story, I have to say. So take this case, A Beautiful Life. It was released the 1st of June 2023. Within that 1 month on Netflix, it generated close to 46 million hours of viewing, according to Netflix's own data in their Netflix engagement report. If you trust their data, then it's a 99 minute film. If you, obviously some viewers jump in and out of the film, but if you try to recalculate according to, let's say, a number of full-time viewers, you end up with a film that, incidentally, the Danish critics didn't really like. Like a generic film that's it's about a fisherman who turns towards being a musician. It's the lead is played by a musician who's quite famous in Denmark and also famous in some markets, internationally at least. But still, the critics really didn't appreciate this film, not even international critics as such. But still, 30 million full-time viewers. If you factor co-viewing into it, it's very likely that 1.5 person on average watched this film every time it was screened. So we're talking about a film that reached maybe 40, 45 million viewers within 1 month. Unless all Danes sat there and hit the rewatch button like 10 times, clearly the audience for this film is not in Denmark. The main audience, that is. It was relatively popular in Denmark, I believe, but still. And Netflix's own data also tell us this. You can see that it pops up in more than 70 countries/territories in the month of June for non-English films. So obviously, what you are discussing here is essentially the question of, well, who are these films for? Are they for export, essentially? Are they for international audiences? Or are they actually a kind of variant of cultural resonance? I've come across this discussion also when I did an interview with the showrunner of the Danish television show called Borgen. And in that case, he, as well as Netflix executives, they were essentially arguing that, okay, Netflix, they picked up the largest chunk of the check for Borgen. They simply supplemented what would otherwise have been public support. So this was, not everyone agrees with this reading, I have to say, but that's sort of the scriptwriters, the main scriptwriters' reading of it, that essentially Netflix were the main co-financer of a television show that essentially was a public service-oriented television show. And this is the same kind of dynamic that you can kind of see in the case of a film like A Beautiful Life, or in Norway, Troll. Troll, the Norwegian film, is actually the most watched non-English film of all. So at least in the VOD space, there is some hope in terms of at least viewers watching our films. The kind of repercussion it has financially, that's a completely different story. But that's where I want to end things today and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And we have time for a couple of questions or comments. Not sure if you want to ask anything. Dai, yes.
Thanks, Manuel. Dahi Makshihi from IADT. Jakob, fantastic presentation, as expected. I wonder, could you come back to the theme that you mentioned a few times around the disruption of COVID and changes in practices and how some of that data varied, and what you might draw from that in terms of short-term change and recovery versus long-term changes in practice, industrial patterns, and so forth. Just inviting you to speculate, if I may.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dahi, for your comments and your question. I was at Cannes for the European Audiovisual Observatory just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the most interesting discussions there was the question of that you also mentioned about the recovery rate. And this is quite interesting to me, and also I think to everyone involved or who sees exhibition as kind of still being important. I think it's fair to say that the discussions about the collapse of windows have kind of subsided by now, it seems. But one pattern I think that's very interesting is to look at what is the new normal in terms of what we can expect in cinemas. So unfortunately, we only have data for 2022. I mean, the problem with comparative research is that you need data across the entire field to do 23. So in some respects, we could already now do 23, but in others we can't. What's really interesting is the question of, are we actually going to end up at a factor 80 level in terms of admissions in cinemas? And there are some reasons that we might end up there. If you look at the recovery rate in 2022, you saw that the Czech Republic and Denmark were the top performers in terms of recovery when you compared to the 2017 to 19 average. So the recovery rate was 82% of the average of those 3 years in Denmark, and I believe 81 in the Czech Republic, something along those lines at least. So not there yet, but close. I interviewed the CEO of the Danish Film Institute in September last year, and at that point he was expecting a close to 100% recovery for 23. That didn't happen. And it didn't happen in the Czech Republic either. Actually, those two countries, their admissions stagnated and actually dropped a little bit. But what you saw in many of the other countries where the recovery rate was lower in 22 is actually they caught up with the recovery rate in the Czech Republic and Denmark, and in many instances actually superseded the recovery rate. So if you look at 22, you find a huge spectrum in terms of recovery rate, and now for 23, it's kind of converging. Around 80%. Some are not recovering that well. Sweden, the UK and Ireland actually, and which maybe we can talk about why that is. I don't have the answer for that. And in some other markets, the recovery rate is as high as in the 90s. None of these European countries have fully recovered yet. And so this is something that is, of course, a cause for concern. It was the European Audiovisual Observatory linked this to the question of production volume. But I think while it's fair to say that production volume has gone up in Europe, generally speaking, I actually don't quite see that pattern in our 7 ecosystems. Yes, Italy, yeah, but why is that important to us? That's maybe not that important. So I think there could be some concerns about this dual aspect of more films out there and maybe a new normal of around factor 80. But I think it's a little too early to say still. But I mean, I think that's one of the discussions that I think is quite interesting. There's other things to say, but I think that I won't say more for now.
I think that. Yep, Liz.
Thank you. Hi, Lies van Vijven, the Lucas School of Arts. First of all, I would have loved to be in the room when you tried to compare the statistics of Flanders with Belgium, but I think it's an entirely different question. I was very intrigued with the concept of domestic audiences and non-domestic audiences. And I wondered, how do you take into account the fact that some of these films had a massive promotional tour due to awards, Oscar nomination, Cannes wins, and how representative would this be if these things were not there?
We have lined up some of that research. I should say that actually we have done some quantitative analysis of festival success also in the report. So we've adopted the Swedish Film Institute to have a kind of a scoring list for awards and nominations at different festivals. I think this work is something that's actually going to take place. It will take place in one of the more value chain oriented work packages within the Cuisine project. So this report kind of lines out the basic premises. It's kind of the way the project is organized. And then we have individual work packages that focus more specifically on one aspect of the value chain. So I think it's very, I mean, I would still have to look at the actual numbers, but I know, let's say in the case of Denmark, I think there's quite a lot of marketing support actually behind festival films. I would still say, although this is perhaps a little bit sort of going out on a ledge, but I would still say, at least in the Danish context, that I would say they tend to promote the films that they fund, as opposed to producing films specifically for export. If you get, I mean, I think there's a real difference there. But we do have colleagues in the research project that have looked at festival patterns, including also presence of our films outside of the big A-list festivals as well. Viune and Indrik, Viune Semaitite and Indrik Ibrus, that some of you might know have been involved in some of that work. But I think the short answer is that we haven't quite done the work yet to make those exact links.
Hi, thank you. David Novak from Lusofona. I'm curious about two things. One is there eventually going to be a look at alternative distribution that bypasses the typical gatekeepers, because there are a lot of films out there that are surviving in a different kind of a path, and the extent to which that can be valued, right? Number one. And the second question is, I'm curious how different the numbers are when you separate out nonfiction and fiction.
The answer to the first question is similar to the other question. That is actually something I'm also involved in that work myself in terms of alternative distribution paths, and that work is still ongoing. So we don't have results there yet, but we'll do some piloting and do some guides in terms of different ways of, let's say, guides for collaborating with globally oriented streaming services, for instance, which is one of the guides that I'll be involved working with, by the way. But we just don't have results for that. In terms of distinctions between fiction and documentary, I think it's a key question. I think, if I have to be honest, I don't think we've done quite enough in terms of research into documentary specifically in this report, for various reasons. But I do think it was to some extent, it was actually interesting to see that the documentary export logics seem to me different from fiction. So although the numbers are quite small for, let's say, the international circulation of documentary films, you actually do see more circulation of documentary films that you might expect actually from our ecosystems. They're just rarely viewed by many people, but they actually seem to follow a different kind of distribution logic, I would say. So there are some of these differences for sure. The scale of documentary films is also staggering in some examples. When you see the output of documentary feature films in some markets, it's quite impressive. But some also do not have to get a theatrical release to get funding, which I think is a key reason for at least the high output of documentary films in my own native country of Denmark, for instance. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Okay, we are right on time, but I would like to conclude with a comment, because you've just mentioned a discussion that I think it's really important for us in this room, which is the issue of the number of films being produced, which is kind of the elephant in the room. So as schools, I think that's a key issue for us, because on one side, artificial intelligence is definitely going to destroy some of the entry jobs that many of our graduates start their careers with, so that will disappear. And then there's the issue of the number of films being produced versus the result. Talking of Portugal in particular, if you do the math, it's a little bit scary, the level of public funding against the level of audiences, the ratings per film, and the number of films being released. At the same time, and a couple of weeks ago, we had some of us were in Lisbon for the C Accelerate conference, where we had a very young and talented Portuguese director that won in Cannes. So we are not talking of a young director with no trajectory whatsoever. He managed to co-produce an horror film and get international sales to the US, for instance, which is not that common. He had 16,000 spectators in theater in Portugal, and he was happy. Okay, 10 years ago that would have been a complete disaster, and the main reason why for him 16,000 was okay was the number of films being released every week. Okay, so I think that this dilemma of are we going the right way? So as schools, we probably want as many films as possible to be produced, because that means more working opportunities, it means more opportunities for our graduates to develop their creative potential and so forth. But from the point of view of, let's call it policy making, it might be the wrong direction to go. So a kind of a final comment, because we know that European Audiovisual Observatory is now resonating a public concern across many European funders that we are spending too much money across too many films, and we should be spending less or the same, but in a smaller number of films. So what's your take on that?
I think it's a very interesting problem. I actually asked the head of the Danish Film Institute very directly about this. because leading up to the last film settlement, the basic arguments from, let's say, leading into some of these political discussions about the oncoming film settlement is, are we in the process of producing so few films that we cannot actually talk of industry? So I think that's a very difficult question to answer in terms of what's the lowest threshold of that you can have of fiction or documentary films in order for there to be a viable working industry, and let's say not a television industry that is from time to time shooting a film. So I think the balance of that is quite. I mean, I think that's very important. I think it's also, from a policy perspective, very useful to look at different films having different kinds of purposes. So let's say if you have a talent scheme within your National Film Board, that could actually be, let's say, an avenue for, let's say, a early starter career filmmaker. He and she might be producing a first film that only is watched by, let's say, 3,000 people or something like that. But you can actually, from time to other, see that, okay, this first step was actually a very important career-wise, as a career trajectory towards actually producing a second or third film that actually reaches more substantial audiences. So I think these concerns about number of productions are sometimes also based on, I think, some miscalculations in terms of what's the film for. But obviously you want films to be watched, I mean, regardless of what kinds of films are being produced. But I think you do have to keep that in mind, that for, let's say, a talent track, that volume of films serves a different kind of purpose, I think. But it is, I think it is a key concern. You could speculate and argue, is it maybe for these kinds of, let's say, New Danish Screen would be in a Danish context, a talent track. Do they necessarily have to have a strong theatrical release? Maybe, maybe not. So I think that's an important issue to keep in mind. But I do think actually there's some possibilities also. I mean, within the larger film and TV industry, of course, there's been a lot of crisis with the collapse of the streaming bubble. But I do think actually that this has actually brought, let's say, talent back towards film to some extent. So let's say there's not the same kind of financing available, or the same kind of, let's say, skills-oriented possibility within the serial fiction now. That, okay, so now you actually have potentially a stronger talent pool interested in films, actually. And you have a bit more of security in terms of the public support schemes upholding some level of production, at least.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jakob. We are right on schedule, so thank you very much. I'll immediately ask Liz to join me, because I don't think we have a break, right? We go...
Well, we actually do need 5 or 10 minutes technical break. We
Okay.
need to change from YouTube to Teams and switch that on, so please
Okay.
just very quick.
Okay, so 5 minutes break. Jakob, thank you very much.